What if I told you? Sending women to the front lines of war might actually signal that a nation is on the brink of collapse. This isn't about discrimination. It's about survival. Throughout history, most countries have avoided deploying large numbers of women directly into frontline combat. And the reason is not what many people think. It's not about capability, it's about the future of an entire nation. To understand this, we need to look at one of the most brutal conflicts in history, the World War II. And more specifically, the Soviet Union's fight for survival at the beginning of the war. Soviet leadership made a critical mistake. They believed that Germany would not attack immediately, even after signing agreements meant to avoid conflict. They underestimated the speed and scale of the German advance. When the invasion began, the consequences were catastrophic. Aircraft were still parked tightly on airfields. Troops were unprepared. Artillery units were not in combat formation. Within just a single day, hundreds of aircraft were destroyed before they could even take off. In the first week alone, nearly 100,000 soldiers were killed, and hundreds of thousands more were captured. Entire defensive systems collapsed under the speed of the German advance. Massive encirclement battles followed, where hundreds of thousands of Soviet troops were captured at once. The road toward Moscow was suddenly exposed at that moment. The Soviet Union faced something far more serious than military defeat. It faced the possibility of total destruction. And so, the government made a desperate decision. They mobilized the entire population, not just men, but women. Around 800,000 Soviet women stepped forward. Unlike in many other countries, they were not limited to support roles. They went directly to the front lines as snipers, pilots, machine gunners, and soldiers. They became the largest female combat force in human history, and they proved something undeniable. They could fight. Some of them became legends. One sniper eliminated over 300 enemy soldiers, including dozens of trained enemy snipers. Another became one of the first female fighter aces, taking down multiple enemy aircraft before being surrounded in battle at just 22 years old. These women didn't just participate in war. They changed history. But something interesting happened. Next, as the situation stabilized, the Soviet Union gradually began pulling many of these women away from the front lines and into support roles like medical care and logistics. This wasn't because they lacked ability. It was because the country needed to think about what would happen after the war. Because war doesn't end when the fighting stops. There is another battlefield rebuilding, and that battlefield depends on population. By the end of World War II, the Soviet Union had lost more than 27 million people. Over 80% of those losses were men, especially men between the ages of 18 and 35, the core of the working and reproductive population. The result? A demographic disaster. Birth rates dropped dramatically. In some areas, entire generations were missing. And this is where the reality becomes clear. From a biological perspective, population recovery depends heavily on women. Even if a country loses a large number of men, population growth can still recover over time. But if a country loses most of its women of childbearing age, recovery becomes nearly impossible. No strategy can replace that. This is why women are often seen as a nation's population reserve. After the war, the Soviet Union introduced extreme policies to recover. Women who had large numbers of children were honored by the state. Families were encouraged to grow. Early marriage and childbirth were promoted. It took decades, but the population slowly recovered. Other countries took different approaches. Some encouraged immigration. Some introduced incentives for family growth. But the core idea remained the same. Rebuilding a nation requires people, and people require time. This is why decisions made during war are never just about winning battles. They are about surviving the future. And there's another harsh reality. Frontline conditions are extremely brutal. From wartime records shows that in certain positions, female soldiers faced even higher casualty risks than male soldiers, not because they were weaker, but because of a combination of physical differences, battlefield conditions, and the way enemies reacted to them. War does not treat anyone equally, and sometimes it becomes even more dangerous. Even in modern times, where technology has changed warfare significantly, the number of women in frontline combat roles is still relatively limited in most countries. Why? Because the core considerations haven't changed. First, strategic importance. Women still represent the long-term future of population stability. Second, logistical challenges. Supporting mixed-gender forces often requires additional infrastructure and planning. And third, role optimization. In many critical areas like communication, intelligence, and medical support, women often perform exceptionally well, so limiting large-scale deployment to the front line is not about exclusion, it's about balance. It's about making decisions that consider both the present and the future. Because in the end, war is not just about who wins today, it's about who still exists tomorrow. So now let me ask you, do you think these decisions are purely strategic? Or do they also reflect deeper values within society? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below, and if you found this video insightful, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss the next story.